Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video.
Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to Black Jewelries and join us for more powerful.
Elijah Cross didn't catch the first sentence. He caught the second one, and it stopped his coffee cup an inch from his mouth. Nobody in that diner even glanced over. Nobody had reason to. By the end of the month, one captain's career would be over, and a file marked closed for 11 months would be reopened for the first time since the day it was signed. But at 8:52 on a gray Tuesday morning in Cleveland, Ohio, sitting on a cracked vinyl stool at the counter of a place called Dot's Diner on East 55th, Elijah didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was that two uniformed officers were standing 4 feet behind him, waiting on a to-go order, laughing about something they were sure nobody in the room could understand. He kept his eyes on the window, a city bus idling across the street, a man selling loose cigarettes out of a cardboard box. Steam curling off his own coffee. He looked exactly like what he was dressed to look, like a freight broker named Marcus Doyle, 41 years old, 3-day stubble, a gray hoodie with a coffee stain on the cuff, the kind of tired that comes from a job nobody envies. 11 months of undercover work had taught him how to disappear inside a room without once looking away from it. She never even fought it, the taller officer said. His name tag read SGTD. Kessler. Family didn't have 2 nickels for a lawyer. What were they going to do? Hire somebody to argue with a coroner's report? The second officer, younger, a buzz cut, 2 coffees balanced in one hand, laughed the particular laugh of a man who's told a story so many times it stopped being real to him. Man, I still think about the sister showing up at the front desk, asking for the body cam footage. And we told her what? Equipment malfunction, Kessler said. Another laugh. Convenient, right? Elijah's hand didn't move. His face didn't move. But somewhere behind his ribs, something clicked into place with the cold, mechanical certainty of a round chambering. The sister. The body cam. Equipment malfunction. He knew those words. 5 months earlier, he'd seen them buried inside a civilian complaint he had no business reading, forwarded to his division by mistake, and never quite deleted from his inbox. Terrence Wallace, 24 years old, dead 11 months, ruled a suicide. A sister named Renee had filed the complaint. She alleged the responding officers refused to preserve the scene, refused to release the footage, and closed the file before she finished giving her statement. He'd filed it away as sad and moved on. Not his case, not his division. Not his problem. It was his problem now. If you're already leaning into this one, go ahead and hit like before we keep going. It actually helps more people find stories like this. Elijah set his cup down without a sound. He didn't turn his head. He didn't need to. The reflection in the window across the counter gave him everything 2 officers in full uniform. Relaxed, unbothered, the specific kind of relaxed that only comes from years of never once being asked to explain yourself. They don't know I'm listening, he thought. They don't know anyone is listening. That's the whole problem. Nobody ever has been. He thought about standing up right there, badge in his jacket pocket, 6 feet from a man named Kessler, who'd apparently made a habit of closing cases the easy way. The thought lasted exactly as long as it took him to remember the black Denali that was supposed to roll past this window in 14 minutes, carrying a man named Victor Marsh, who had spent 11 months believing Elijah Cross was nothing more than a freight broker with a gambling debt and a loose relationship with paperwork. Marsh was the last name on a distribution case that had cost the Bureau 2 years and 2 confidential informants to build. If Elijah so much as flinched wrong at this counter, Marsh's people would know within the hour. 2 informants, still breathing, still inside, exposed the moment anyone started wondering why the quiet guy from the freight company turned out to be federal. He could not react. He could not leave early. He could not so much as glance over his shoulder without risking a year of his life and 2 other people's lives along with it. All he could do was sit very, very still and listen. You ever hear anything back on the file review? The younger one asked, voice dropping not out of caution, just habit, the reflex of men who'd talked about the job in public for years because the job had never once bitten them for it. "Funny. Why would I?" Kessler said. "It's closed, 11 months closed, nobody's opening that again." Funny. Elijah picked his coffee back up. His hand was completely steady. He made himself take a slow sip, made himself watch the street the way a bored man watches a street while one sentence looped behind his eyes like a confession he had no legal way to use. Funny. "It's closed. Nobody's opening that again." Through the glass, a black Denali corner 3 minutes early and began to slow. Funny. He didn't move. Funny. But for the first time in 11 months, he understood exactly what it felt like to be trapped between two rooms at once, one where the man he'd spent a year hunting was about to walk through the door, and another, invisible to everyone else in the diner, where a case buried 11 months ago had just quietly started breathing again, 4 feet behind him. Funny. He had no idea yet which room was going to be harder to survive. The Denali pulled away again at 9/7, Marsh never looking twice at the man near the window. Funny. By the time the diner door swung shut behind Kessler and his partner unhurried, coffees in hand, already talking about a fantasy football trade, Elijah had ordered a second coffee he didn't want, just to buy himself 3 more minutes of sitting still. Funny. That was the part he couldn't stop turning on the drive back to the field office. Funny. Not the confession, the ease of it. They forgot they'd said it the second they said it. Funny. He didn't write a report that afternoon. He told himself it was because Marsh's case needed him sharp for 6 more weeks. Funny. That was true. It wasn't the whole truth, and he knew it by the second night, when he opened his laptop at 11:40 and typed Wallace, Terrence into a database he had no active reason to be searching. Funny. Before he hit enter, he made himself sit with the cost of it. 11 months of Marsh trusting the wrong face. Funny. 2 informants still alive, because nobody had reason to look at them twice. His own name clean, for now on a case his section chief had already started mentionings in the same sentence as a promotion board. Funny. None of it would survive him being wrong about this, or being right in a way nobody wanted proven. Funny. He typed the name anyway. The complaint was exactly where he remembered it, pulled up through the regional intelligence portal, the same shared access database every federal, state, and local agency in the metro fed into and drew from. Funny. Officially, it existed for pattern analysis across jurisdictions. Unofficially, it was the closest thing to a backdoor into 100 departments' files that still counted as authorized use. Funny. Filed by Renee Wallace, 11 months and 9 days ago. 2 paragraphs, flagged closed within 3 weeks by an internal review, citing insufficient corroborating evidence. Funny. No follow-up interview on record, no body cam footage attached, a field marked in flat gray text, unavailable equipment malfunction. Funny. The same 4 words Kessler had laughed about over coffee less than 12 hours earlier. Funny. Elijah pulled the original incident report next. Responding Officer D. Kessler, Badge 331 and Officer R. Funny. Briggs, Badge 4108. Cause of death, self-inflicted. The supervisor who'd signed off on both the death investigation and the later complaint dismissal was a name he didn't recognize, a captain, 2 ranks up. Funny. He almost stopped there. It would have been easy to stop there. 1 bad case. Funny. 1 grieving family failed by an overworked system. Tragic, but not exactly a federal matter. Funny. He told himself that for about 4 minutes, the time it took to run Kessler had that number through the portal's cross-jurisdiction case index, a search any agency with regional access could legitimately run, logged under his own credentials, impossible to later pretend he hadn't made. Funny. 2 more names came back. Marisol Fenwick, 31, fall from a 3rd-floor balcony, ruled accidental, closed in 17 days. Funny. A neighbor's statement, never followed up on, mentioned she'd called her mother that same morning to say a man had been parked outside her building for 2 days straight. Funny. James Odom, 28, single vehicle collision, no witnesses, ruled unrelated to any prior police contact, despite 2 earlier domestic disturbance calls logged to the same address. Funny. Closed in 12 days. Same reviewing captain on both files. Same phrase, insufficient corroborating evidence appearing word for word in both dismissed complaints, like something copied out of a template nobody thought anyone would ever read twice. And in every single file, the same field filled in the same way. Body cam footage unavailable. Equipment malfunction. 3 incidents. 3 separate technical failures. Not one supervisor above Kessler had apparently thought that worth asking about twice. Elijah sat back from the screen. The apartment around him went quiet in the particular way a room gets quiet when a person realizes they are no longer looking at one bad night. They were looking at a pattern with a signature on it. He waited until Friday to bring it to his supervisor, Assistant Special Agent in charge of Hitfield, mostly because Friday was the only day she didn't have back-to-back briefings. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. The diner, the database, the 3 names. Arms crossed, expression giving away nothing until he finished. Where were you exactly when you overheard this? Dot's Diner on East 55th. I was staging for the Marsh handoff, so you were in an active undercover posture, off the books from anything to do with local PD misconduct, listening to 2 uniforms talk about a case that isn't your division, isn't your jurisdiction, and isn't officially anything but a closed file. She said it flat, not unkindly, the way someone recites a problem back to make sure they've understood its shape correctly. Elijah, I believe you heard what you heard. That's not the issue. Then what is? You don't have a complaint. You have a memory of a conversation you can't legally use, cross-referenced against 3 files you pulled, through a database access that's logged under your name, tied to searches that have nothing to do with Marsh. The kind of activity that's going to raise exactly the sort of internal question neither of us wants attached to you 6 weeks before indictment. She exhaled. If this were anyone else walking in here with this, I'd tell them to write it up as a tip and let it sit in somebody's inbox for 6 months. But it's you. A small, tired concession, not quite a smile. I'll make one call quietly to someone who can pull the file properly, through a door that doesn't have your fingerprints on it. That's what I can give you right now. It wasn't nothing. It also wasn't enough, and they both knew it. If you've made it this far, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and it's honestly the best part of doing this. The call came back Monday morning, and it came back wrong. Whitfield found him at his desk, phone still in her hand. Kessler's up for a commendation, she said. No greeting, no preamble. Departmental award, case closure rate, community outreach. Ceremonies in 3 weeks. Something settled low and cold in Elijah's chest. For what exactly? For being efficient. She set the phone down. 17 days, 12 days, 21 days on Wallace. Every file in his stack closes fast, clean, no loose threads. To anybody who isn't looking at all 3 side by side, it reads like a good cop with a strong clearance rate. She looked at him. You're the only person who's looked at them side by side. Elijah thought of Kessler's voice through the window's reflection, easy and unbothered, 4 feet from a man he'd never once considered a threat. It's closed. Nobody's opening that again. In 3 weeks, a room full of people who trusted a badge more than they'd ever thought to question one were going to stand up and applaud him for it. We need somebody who was never asked to be quiet in the first place, Elijah said. Somebody who already knows nobody's coming. Whitfield didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone careful. In a way, he recognized the sound of someone handing him something she couldn't take back. Terrence Wallace's sister still lives 20 minutes from here. She's called the department's tip line 4 times since the case closed. Nobody's called her back once. Renee Wallace answered the door in scrubs, like she was either coming off a shift or heading into one. She looked at Elijah's credentials for exactly as long as it took to read them, then looked at his face for longer than that. FBI, she said, not a question. Took you long enough. I found out 4 days ago, Elijah said. I understand if that doesn't mean much. It doesn't. She didn't move from the doorway. You're not the first person who stood here saying they wanted to help. He didn't argue with that. He waited. After a moment, she stepped back and let the door swing open, which was as close to an invitation as he was going to get. The apartment was small and clean and full of Terrence. A photograph on the bookshelf, a young man laughing at something outside the frame. one arm slung around Renee's shoulders. A jacket still hanging on a hook by the door that Elijah correctly guessed nobody had moved in 11 months. You want to know what happened, Renee said, sitting across a kitchen table with a rooster-shaped napkin holder, something a grandmother had probably given them as a joke that stuck. Everybody wants to know what happened. Nobody's ever wanted to know what happened after. Tell me the after. She looked at him a long moment, like she was deciding whether that question had ever been asked of her sincerely before. They came to the door at 2 in the morning, not to tell me to ask me questions. Where was I that night? Did Terrence have money problems? Did he seem depressed, like I was the one who needed explaining? Her hands lay flat on the table. I didn't get to see him for 2 days. They said the scene was still being processed. By the time they let anyone in, it wasn't a scene anymore. It was just an apartment somebody had already cleaned. Who cleaned it? That's the thing. Her jaw tightened. Nobody would tell me. I asked 3 times. Got 3 different answers. A restoration company, a city contractor, standard protocol. None of it checked out when I called around. Elijah kept his voice even, though something in his chest had gone very still. Did you ask for the body cam footage? 4 times. She said it like a number she'd carried so long it had worn smooth. First they told her it would take time to process. She filed again. Then came the phrase Elijah already knew by heart, delivered so casually the second time that she'd stopped believing any of it by the third. Equipment malfunction. You know what's funny? I used to think if I just asked the right way, using the right words, somebody would eventually tell me the truth. I don't think that anymore. I'm not going to promise you I'm different, Elijah said. Good. I don't think promises are worth much to me right now. I can tell you what I found. You can decide what that's worth. That got her attention in a way nothing else had, not sympathy, not credentials. He told her about the shared database, about Marisol Fenwick and James Odom, about the identical dismissal language, the identical equipment excuse, the same captain's signature moving through all 3 files like a hand, steering a wheel nobody had noticed was even being turned. Renee didn't speak for a while. When she did, her voice had changed, not softer exactly, but less braced. There were bruises, she said, on his knuckles. The report said self-inflicted, no signs of struggle. I saw him at the funeral home before it was too late to see anything. His knuckles were bruised. Nobody ever asked me about that. I brought it up twice, and both times somebody changed the subject so smoothly I almost didn't notice they'd done it. That should have been photographed. Documented. It's not in the file I saw. No, she said. It wouldn't be. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable so much as heavy, the kind that settles after 2 people have finally said something true to each other and don't quite know what to do with it yet. Elijah let it sit. He'd learned that too. Filling silence too quickly is its own kind of disrespect. I'm not asking you to trust me, he said finally. I'm asking you to tell me if there's anything you still have. Anything nobody ever thought to ask for the right way. Renee studied him the way a person studies a decision they've already half made and are only now admitting to. Then she stood, crossed to a drawer beneath the rooster napkin holder, and pulled out a small external hard drive, small enough to fit in a coat pocket. My neighbor across the hall has a doorbell camera, she said, faces the stairwell. Terrence's door is at the end of that hall. Nobody ever asked her for anything, because nobody ever knew to ask. She turned the drive over once in her hand, like she was still deciding whether handing it over made her brave or just tired of being the only one who remembered. I never gave this to anyone, because the last few people who wanted to help walked in here saying almost exactly what you just said. Her phone buzzed once on the table. She glanced down, and whatever she saw made her go still in a way that had nothing to do with Elijah. She turned the screen toward him without a word. A notification from her neighbor's cloud storage account, forwarded automatically to her own email months ago and apparently still active. Security alert. A sign-in attempt was blocked from an unrecognized device 11 minutes ago. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Renee looked at the drive still sitting in her palm, then at the door, like she was recalculating how thin the walls of the apartment actually were. "Honey, nobody's supposed to know that account exists," she said quietly. "I never told the department it did." "Honey." She looked at him, then at the door, then back at the drive. "Convince me you're not next on the list of people who walk out of here and forget." "Honey, if you're hooked already, go ahead and subscribe. I promise this one is going somewhere." "Honey." Renee handed him the drive 4 minutes after the alert, not because his answer had convinced her he hadn't given one yet, but because she'd looked at the blocked login a second time and decided that whatever she believed about him mattered less than getting the footage somewhere. The department couldn't reach it first. "Honey, copy it tonight," she said, already reaching for her coat. "Copy it twice." By midnight, he'd done both. "Honey." One backup on a bureau-issued drive, logged into evidence under a case number that didn't exist yet. "Honey." One on a personal drive he kept nowhere near his apartment. He didn't watch the footage that night. "Honey." He told himself it was because a forensic tech needed to preserve the file properly before anyone touched the original data. "Honey." That was true. It was also easier than admitting he wanted one more night where the worst of it was still just a possibility. "Honey." He didn't get one. At 6:14 the next morning, Whitfield called before he'd finished his coffee. "Honey, somebody accessed the audit log for your Wallace-adjacent searches," she said. "No greeting. Not you." "Honey, somebody looking at you looking." "Who?" "Audit trail says a terminal inside the department, logged under a supervisor's credentials." "Honey, I can't tell you which one yet. That request has to go through channels, and channels take days." "Honey, I don't think we have days. Elijah, whoever it is, knows someone federal has been pulling those 3 names." "Honey, they don't know it's you specifically, yet sat in the air between them like a held breath." "Honey." The original doorbell footage never made it to the lab intact. Elijah drove to Renee's neighbor's building himself, credentials in hand, prepared to formally request the original cloud files as corroboration for the copy already sitting in evidence. "Honey." The neighbor, a retired teacher named Alma Whitaker, met him at her door with the open, unguarded politeness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of a badge. "Honey." "Oh, that account," she said, pulling up the app on her phone. "I've had nothing but trouble with it lately." "Honey." She frowned, tapped the screen twice, harder than it needed. "That's strange. What is it?" "Honey." "It says my subscription lapsed. Footage older than 72 hours is gone, but I never let it lapse." "Honey. I pay for the year. I just renewed in March." Elijah kept his voice level, the same stillness that had gotten him through a diner, with 2 men who'd once decided a family didn't deserve the truth. "Honey, can you show me the billing history?" She could. The subscription had been active straight through until 9 days earlier, when it was canceled and immediately reinstated under a new billing cycle, wiping every file recorded before that date from the company's retained storage. "Honey." 9 days ago was 19 days after Terrence Wallace's death, long enough that no one grieving would think to check. "Honey." Recent enough that it couldn't be coincidence. "Somebody canceled and restarted my subscription," Alma said slowly, understanding arriving in real time. "Honey, who can even do that? I never gave anyone my login." Elijah already knew the shape of the answer, even without a name attached to it yet. "Honey." Someone had found a way to make the footage disappear quietly, cleanly, timed to a window. Nobody official would think to check someone who'd had 11 months to think about a doorbell camera. Nobody had bothered to ask about, until very recently. "Honey." They know Renee kept something, he thought. They just don't know she already gave it away. "Honey." That was the only thing standing between the truth and total erasure, 48 hours of margin, and a copy sitting in a drawer, at a field office, instead of a cloud account somebody else controlled. "Honey." He called Renee from the car. "The subscription was tampered with. Original cloud files are gone." "Honey." "It doesn't matter, we already have the copy." Silence on the line, longer than it should have taken to process. "Honey." "They went after it," she finally said, "before you'd even convinced me to give it to you." "Honey." "Yes, then they already knew I had it before I decided to trust you." "Honey." Her voice had gone quiet in a way that wasn't relief, which means somebody's known about that camera longer than 4 days, Agent Cross. "Honey." which means somebody's been watching this a lot closer than a routine review. He didn't have an answer for that, because she was right, and there wasn't a version of the truth that would make it less unsettling. He told her to change her locks and vary her routine for a few days' advice that sounded thin even as he said it. The message arrived at 9:41 that night while he was still parked outside his own apartment with the engine off, trying to decide how much of this belonged in a written report and how much would only paint a target on people who hadn't asked for one. The number wasn't saved, not local, 3 words, no punctuation, no signature, leave it closed. Elijah sat with the phone lit in his hand for a long time, running the same 3 possibilities on a loop. A bluff from someone rattled by an audit log, a message from someone who had no idea how little he'd actually documented yet. Or the coldest possibility of all proof that whoever had accessed that database trail already knew exactly who they were warning, and exactly where he lived to send it. He didn't reply. He photographed the screen, logged the number, and forwarded both to Whitfield with a single line, "Somebody already knows." Then he sat in the dark a while longer, thinking about a bruised set of knuckles nobody had ever photographed, and a doorbell camera that had almost disappeared 9 days too late to matter, and wondering how many other names, closed just as quietly, had never had anyone left behind stubborn enough to keep a backup. Stick around, the next part is the reason I wanted to tell you this story in the first place. The forensic tech called it in on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the text that told Elijah to leave it closed. Her name was Priya Nandakumar, and she'd spent 11 days doing nothing dramatic: timestamp verification, metadata extraction, chain of custody documentation, the unglamorous work that either holds up in front of a judge or doesn't. The doorbell file is clean, she told Elijah and Whitfield, sliding a report across the table instead of narrating it. Original capture, no editing artifacts. Timestamp consistent with the manufacturer's own server logs from that week, logs the company still had, since Renee's copy predates whatever happened to the account. She tapped the page. It shows Kessler and Briggs entering the building at 11:47 p.m. 40 minutes before the official incident report says they arrived. Whitfield read the summary twice. 40 minutes. 40 minutes nobody can explain, Priya said, on a night the responding officers already told a grieving family nothing was recoverable. That was the first thing that stopped being deanable. Not a confession overheard through a window. A file with a manufacturer's signature on it, sitting in evidence, saying something no closed report could quietly outlast. The internal audit took longer than anyone wanted, not hours, 9 days, moving through IT security, then through a command staff briefing Elijah wasn't in the room for, because it wasn't his case to run, only his case to have started. When the name finally came back, it wasn't Kessler. It was Captain Warren Fitch, the reviewing supervisor, whose signature had sat quietly under 3 closed files for over a year, the same man who'd flagged the database audit log the moment somebody unfamiliar started asking questions. Fitch was placed on administrative leave the following Monday, pending an internal affairs investigation that would take months, not days. Kessler and Briggs were reassigned to desk duty the same week, under a review that hadn't concluded by the time the U.S. Attorney's Office formally opened a federal civil rights inquiry into all 3 closed cases. No press conference, no perp walk, just paperwork moving through the specific, unglamorous channels that actual accountability moves through slower than anyone wanted and realer than anything rushed ever quite manages to be. 3 days before it was scheduled, the department quietly pulled Kessler's commendation from the ceremony program. No public statement. Whitfield heard about it secondhand, from someone who'd noticed his name missing off a printed list and asked why. Elijah met Renee one more time, at the same kitchen table with the rooster napkin holder, 3 weeks after the last time he'd sat there believing far less than he did now. They opened a federal review, he told her. Terrence's case is part of it, so are the other 2. She didn't smile, not exactly. She looked instead like someone setting down something heavy she hadn't realized she was still carrying. "You believe me now," she said, You believed me the day you knocked. That's not the same as anyone else believing me. No, Elijah agreed, it's not. But it's the part that's actually true, regardless of what anyone else decides. The rest is catching up. A few people came before you, Renee said. Not one of them came back with anything. You did. She looked at the drawer under the napkin holder. I don't know if that makes you different or just lucky. Maybe both. I'd rather be lucky and right, Azida said, than confident and wrong. She almost laughed at that, a small surprise sound, the first one he'd heard from her. It didn't erase 11 months. It wasn't supposed to. The Marsh case closed the following month. On schedule, with an indictment that had nothing to do with any of this, and everything to do with the 11 months Elijah had spent being someone else. He testified in civilian clothes, no longer needing to disappear into a room. It was a small thing, sitting in a witness chair instead of a diner booth, being exactly who he was instead of who the job required. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like being allowed to exhale. He drove past Dot's diner a week later, out of some impulse he didn't examine too closely, and found himself parking instead of passing. He went in, ordered coffee, sat at the same counter, in the same seat where a year of careful invisibility had ended the moment two men forgot the room had ears. The waitress, who'd been working that morning, was still there. She didn't recognize him. No reason she should have. He hadn't been anyone worth remembering. That had been the whole point. He sat with his coffee and didn't have to disappear into anything. Nobody behind him was talking about something they thought no one would ever hear. The room was just a room. That, more than anything else that had happened since, felt like the actual ending. Terrence Wallace never got his life back. No investigation, however thorough, however overdue, could give Renee the years of birthdays her brother would have had, or undo the 2A. Knock that treated a grieving sister like a suspect, instead of a person who just lost someone. What the investigation gave her instead was smaller, and in its way no less necessary, a record that finally matched what she'd known from the very beginning. A file that could no longer be closed by somebody hoping nobody would ever look twice. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive as a single moment. Sometimes it arrives the way this one did, quietly, procedurally, 3 weeks and 9 days, and one stubborn doorbell camera at a time, built by people willing to keep listening long after everyone else had decided the conversation was over. If you'd overheard what Elijah did that morning at the counter, would you have stayed still or given yourself away? If this one stayed with you, tell me in the comments, and if you want more stories where one overlooked detail changes everything, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling them. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.